All right, today we're going to tackle a really tough but incredibly important topic, suicide. Our goal here is to try and understand it a little better, to unpack the why behind it, and then, most importantly, to look at the very real pathways to prevention and hope.
Okay, let's just start with a number to ground ourselves in the reality of this. 1 million. That's how many people, an estimated 1 million people, die by suicide around the world every single year. It's a huge number, and it really forces us to ask, why?
So to even begin to get our heads around this, we've got to be really clear on what we're actually talking about. Defining the crisis is the very first step. A pioneering researcher named Edwin Shneidman gave us this really important definition. And I want you to focus on one word here, intentional. See, suicide isn't just something that happens. It's defined as a conscious, direct effort to end one's own life. And that distinction, it's absolutely crucial. But Shneidman didn't stop there. What's really interesting is he saw that not everyone has the same motivation. He broke it down into 4 different types of people. You have the death seekers, who clearly intend to die. Then there are the death initiators, who believe death is already coming for them and they're just speeding it up. You've also got death ignorers, who think they're trading this life for a better one. And finally, the death darers. These are folks who are kind of ambivalent. They take huge risks that could easily end in death, almost leaving it to... Okay, so we've got a handle on the what. Now, let's move on to the really tough part, unpacking the why. What is it that drives someone to this point? What are the triggers, and what are the deeper causes at play? And Shneidman had a really powerful idea about this. He argued that the common denominator for suicide isn't actually a desire to die. No, it's the desperate need to escape something he called psychopain. Think of it as this: deep, unbearable psychological pain that just feels completely intolerable.
And that kind of intense pain, that psychopathy, it could do something really dangerous to a person's thinking. Their perspective gets incredibly narrow. Everything becomes black and white, all or nothing. And that's where this quote really hits home. The 4-letter word in suicide is only. The world of options just shrinks and shrinks until suicide feels like the only thing left to do.
So what are the things that can push someone into that state of hopelessness? Well, it's usually not just one thing. It's often a mix of triggers. We're talking about huge, stressful events like losing a job or the trauma of combat. It could be deep social isolation or a serious illness that causes constant pain. Then you have substance use, existing mental health struggles, and even something called the contagion effect, where one suicide can sometimes trigger others.
Right, so researchers have looked at this from a few different angles to get at that deeper why. You've got the psychodynamic perspective, which basically says suicide can result from anger at other people that gets redirected back at yourself. Then there's the sociocultural view, which argues that how connected or disconnected you are from your community is a huge factor. And of course, there's the biological lens, which looks at brain chemistry, like low levels of serotonin. None of these tell the whole story on their own, but together, they start to form a much clearer picture.
Okay, so we've talked about the theories, but what does the actual data tell us? Let's take a look at some of the patterns, because they reveal some really important and sometimes surprising things about who is most at risk.
One of the most striking things you see in the data is this really tragic paradox between men and women. Look at this. Women attempt suicide at a rate 3 times higher than men, but men complete suicide at a rate 4 times higher. So what's going on there? Well, researchers believe it mostly comes down to the methods people use. Men tend to choose more lethal means, which leaves very little chance for survival or intervention.
The data also really backs up that sociocultural idea we mentioned earlier, that our connections to other people are a huge protective shield. I mean, one study found that half the people who died by suicide had no close friends. We see that divorced people have higher rates than married people. And then there's age. The risk of suicide actually tends to go up as we get older, with the elderly being at the highest risk. It's a tragic reality as they often face so much loss at once. So here's the most important takeaway from all of this. Everything we've just talked about, the definitions, the triggers, the patterns, this isn't just academic information. The whole point of understanding this is so that we can build real, effective pathways to prevention. And that starts with what happens after an attempt. For someone who survives, therapy is just so critical. The first goal, obviously, is to keep them safe. But after that, the real work begins. Reducing that psychological pain we talked about, helping them find hope again, and giving them new tools to handle stress. And we know that certain kinds of therapy, like cognitive behavioral therapy, can be incredibly effective at doing just that.
But what about when someone is in the middle of a crisis, right now?
That's where things like suicide prevention hotlines are an absolute lifeline. The people on the other end of the line, they're trained to follow a really clear set of steps. It's all about, first, just establishing a connection. Then, understanding the problem, figuring out the immediate risk, seeing what resources the person has, and then together, making a plan to get through the next hours and days safe.
And beyond that one-on-one intervention, there are things we can do as a whole society. And some of the most proven strategies are surprisingly simple. Research shows again and again that just limiting access to the most common means of suicide saves lives. We're talking about things like putting up barriers on bridges or making medications safer. It's a simple concept. Putting time and distance between a person in crisis and a lethal method can be enough to save a life.
So let's bring this all together. Suicide is, without a doubt, a deeply complex issue. It's born from a place of unbearable pain. But here's the thing we have to remember. That pain is so often temporary. And as we've seen, suicide is not inevitable. Prevention is absolutely possible. So that leaves us with a question, really for all of us to think about. Knowing that there's hope and knowing that prevention works, how can we, each of us, do our part to open up the conversation and fight the stigma?